Menelaus of Sparta was not using a sword. He was using his bare hands. He was twisting a heavy, horsehair-crested helmet, hauling Paris backward through the dirt toward the Greek lines. The thick leather chin strap was digging deep into Paris's throat, cutting off his air, choking the life out of him. Paris was thrashing wildly. His heels dragged deep trenches in the dry dust. He was seconds away from death. And the thousands of men watching from the limestone walls of Troy, and the thousands of Greeks leaning heavily on their ash spears, did not make a single sound. After 10 years of bronze striking bronze, of ships rotting in the salt wind, of pyres burning through the night and disease stripping the camps, they were watching the war end. The plague of it, the hunger of it. It was going to be finished cleanly, right here in the dirt between the armies. But the killing did not stop. The war would rage on to consume them all. The men on the plain believed they could chain a decade of madness with a single oath. But human oaths mean nothing when the gods desire blood. The cruelty of Olympus was not just in stealing a victory. It was in destroying the highest law of the ancient world. Hours before Menelaus wrapped his hands around that helmet, the killing had stalled. There was no glory left on the plain, only the slow, undeniable certainty of death. The armor was heavy with rust and dried blood. The men were hollowed out by grief and dysentery. They were no longer fighting for honor. They were fighting because they had forgotten how to stop. Into that heavy stillness stepped Paris. He wore the skin of a leopard draped over his shoulders, flashing a curved bow and twin spears. He stood in the open space between the armies, offering a challenge to the Greek lines. A single combat. Winner takes Helen. Winner takes the stolen wealth of Sparta. The loser dies in the dirt, and the remaining men pack their rotting ships and sail home. The armies did not just agree, they wept with relief. A great collective exhale swept across the plains. Men stripped off their heavy bronze armor and dropped their shields to the earth. They ceased to be soldiers. They became witnesses to a sacred covenant. They brought out unblemished lambs. They carried mixing bowls of dark, heavy wine. Agamemnon, king of the Greeks, and the elders of Troy stood before the watching camps. Agamemnon drew a ritual knife and cut the wool from the heads of the lambs, distributing it to the leaders of both sides. Then, he raised his hands to the sky and swore the oath aloud. He drew the blade across the throats of the lambs. They bled out into the dry earth. The men poured the unmixed wine upon the ground, and as the dark liquid soaked into the dust, the armies spoke the curse as one voice: Zeus, and all you immortal gods. Whoever breaks this truce first, let his brains, and the brains of his children, be poured out upon the ground, just as this wine is poured. The Trojans swore it. The Greeks swore it. The oath was sealed in blood, wine, and stone. They had bound the chaos of a 10-year slaughter into a single, unbreakable contract. The war was no longer in the hands of fate. It was in the hands of two men. The space was cleared. The lots were drawn. The duel began. It was not a contest. It was an execution. Paris threw his spear first, but the heavy bronze point struck the massive layered shield of Menelaus and bent uselessly, like soft lead against a stone wall. Menelaus prayed aloud to Zeus for rightful vengeance. He stepped into his throw and hurled his own spear with terrifying force. It punched straight through Paris's shield, ripping through his heavy armor and tearing the linen tunic across his ribs. Paris twisted away just in time to save his flesh, but Menelaus was already moving. He drew his silver-studded sword, raised it high, and brought it down on the crest of Paris's helmet with all the weight of his 10 years of fury. With a sharp crack, the sword shattered into 4 pieces. Menelaus screamed at the sky, cursing Zeus for his cruelty, but his rage propelled him forward. He lunged with his bare hands, grabbed the thick horsehair crest of Paris's helmet, and threw the Trojan prince to the ground. That was the moment the armies watched, holding their breath, the thick strap choking Paris, the end of the war dragging through the dust. Justice finally. Seconds away. Then, the strap snapped. It did not break from the force of the pull. The leather was newly cut from a slaughtered ox. It was unbreakable by mortal hands. It snapped because Aphrodite, the goddess of love, was standing invisible in the dust. She refused to watch her chosen mortal die. Menelaus stumbled backward, the sudden release of tension throwing him off balance. He looked down at his hands. He was holding an empty bronze shell. He turned in a blind rage, hurling the empty helmet into the Greek lines. He tore a bronze spear from the dirt and charged back to the spot to finish the kill. But Paris was gone. Where the prince had been lying, choking on his own blood, there was only a thick, unnatural mist. Aphrodite had wrapped him in a cloud and swept him off the battlefield entirely. She carried him over the walls, dropping him safely inside his own perfumed bedroom in the heart of Troy. Down on the plain, Menelaus stalked through the Trojan ranks like a starving beast. He was hunting for the man he was rightfully owed, and the Trojans did not try to hide Paris. They did not raise their spears against the Spartan king. The myth tells us clearly, the Trojans hated Paris like Black Death. If they had seen him, they would have handed him over to be slaughtered. Agamemnon's voice rang out across the quiet battlefield, echoing off the high walls of Troy. The victory belongs to Menelaus. Hand over the woman. Hand over the wealth. By the oaths they had sworn, he was entirely right. Paris had fled the field. The duel was forfeit. But high above the dirt, on the peaks of Mount Olympus, the gods were holding a council. Zeus looked down at the paused war. He suggested to the assembly that perhaps they should let the oath stand. Let Troy survive. Let Menelaus take his wife and go home. Hera, the queen of heaven, raged at the thought. She hated Troy with a violence that could not be measured or reasoned with. She did not want his surrender. She wanted the high walls thrown down. She wanted the city burned to ash. She wanted the blood of every Trojan poured into the sea. Zeus yielded to her wrath. He sent Athena down to the battlefield with a single cold command. Make the Trojans break the oath. Make them commit an act so vile, so entirely unforgivable, that no man or god could ever defend their walls again. Down on the plain, thousands of men stood perfectly still. The heat was suffocating. The peace was fragile, held together by nothing but the spilled blood of the lambs and the terror of the gods. Athena took the form of a Trojan spearman. She moved silently through the tense ranks until she found a master archer named Pandarus. He was a man deeply proud of his bow, a beautiful weapon crafted from the polished horns of a wild ibex. Athena whispered into his ear. She poured poison into his mind, promising him eternal glory and heavy gold from Paris if he simply raised his bow and struck down the Spartan king right now, while his guard was down. Blinded by the sudden promise of fame, Pandarus listened. He unstrung his bow. He selected a feathered arrow that had never been fired. He crouched low, hiding behind the heavy ox-hide shields of his own men so the Greeks across the plain would not see him drawing the string back. He pulled the string to his chest. The heavy iron arrowhead rested perfectly on the bone of the bow. He released it. The arrow screamed across the open space. It bypassed the heavy shields. It bypassed the sacred peace. It struck Menelaus perfectly where the golden clasps of his belt met his armored chestplate. It drove through the bronze. It drove through the linen tunic. It bit deep into his flesh. Dark blood flowed down the king's thighs, pooling at his ankles in the dirt. When Agamemnon saw his brother bleeding, the world collapsed. He took Menelaus's hand, and he began to weep. The Greeks standing around them shuddered. The stillness of the plain finally broke. Agamemnon knew exactly what the blood meant, and he spoke the terrible truth aloud. The Trojans have trampled the oaths. They have made the sacrifices a joke. He knew that because the oath was broken, Troy was marked for absolute ruin. The gods would have to punish the perjury. The brains of the Trojans would be poured out upon the ground, just as the wine was poured. But he also knew the immediate, terrible cost. The clean end they had prayed for was dead. There would be no surrender now. There would be no negotiations. The oaths of men had been erased. The Trojan ranks began to move. The shields locked together into a wall of bronze. The spears came down. The fragile peace was shattered by a single arrow. The war roared back to life, uglier and more merciless than before. Oaths meant nothing when Olympus desired blood. The armies crashed together, returning to the slow, brutal work of slaughter. And out by the rotting ships, sitting entirely alone in his tent, Achilles was still refusing to fight. The Greeks were now trapped in a cursed, lawless war, and their greatest weapon was watching them bleed. If you want to see what finally drags Achilles out of his tent, and how the gods continue to punish the men of the plain, subscribe and stay with Mythkipedia. The destruction of Troy is just beginning.